Hey everybody, welcome back to class. Can you believe this is our final week together? Boy, how time flies when you are studying organizational behavior. Now, this week we're going to talk about sort of that highest level of organizational thinking, which is the organizational level. Now, you remember we started off with this model, right? I've been going over this again. Individual, interpersonal, group, organization, right? So we finally arrived at the organization and even that fifth level where the organization links with other organizations. So today we're going to talk about a few things. The textbook covers three main topics: structure, culture, and change. And I think I'm going to focus just in on the culture piece. You can read about structure and change management in your textbook, but I'd like to take the time today and really focus in on culture. Because I believe that it has a lot of significance. And it's been said that, culture will eat strategy for lunch. And this idea that who you are, what your values are, your ongoing history and behavior is so important to the results of your organization. You can have a great strategy, but if your culture does not support that strategy, it's not going to go anywhere. So I feel like culture really is kind of the queen of this whole area here, and so that's why I'm going to focus. And again, these other ones are important. You need to understand them as OB students, but I will not be lecturing on them. Cool. So hang on there. I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour through the world of organizational culture. Now, this idea of culture is not new. It's been around for a while. Edgar Schein in the 80s sort of popularized it. Originally, we thought about culture from an anthropological perspective. And, people were not aware of culture until they went to one that was different than their own. And have you ever noticed if you go to a different country, you spend some time in a different place, how different it is? Man, they do things different, and they eat different foods, and they dress different, and they talk different, and it's just so different. Their culture is different. Yeah. So when you get out of your culture and you go to another culture, you realize how different cultures can be. Well, the same thing can happen in organizations as well. And so Schein and others begin to use this idea of culture to describe what is going on in organizations and what sets them apart from one another. And so culture has been defined most simply as, the way we do things around here, right? So you may have worked in the same type of organization. Let's just say you worked in auto parts manufacturing organization A, and you worked for them for 10 years, and then you came over to auto parts manufacturing B, organization B, and you said, wow, they both made parts, but man, these guys did it a lot different than these guys did. And so what was that difference there? It was probably culture. No, of course, a lot has to do with strategy and those kinds of things, but culture is really the unique factor in any organization. It's a byproduct of many years of history, of leaders, of repeated experiences, of worldview, the way we've established our view of what's true and what's good. It's about the assumptions that we've made about what is good and right, and it's about the values that we've built up based on those. And one of the models I like to use to describe culture is the iceberg model. And you guys have seen the classic picture of the iceberg, and this idea that 90% of an iceberg is below water. And what you see on the top of the water there is only 10%. Well, culture is like that. So we can see things about culture, for example, language and dress and artifacts, the building, the physical layout, things like that. But what's driving culture, what's supporting that, is that other 90%. And what are those 90%? Well, a lot of it is, as I mentioned, assumptions. And what are assumptions? Assumptions are unarticulated realities. It's things that are so true, we believe to be so true, that we don't even need to talk about it, right? And then on top of assumptions are what are values. Now, values may be articulated or they may not be articulated. Sometimes we articulate values, but they really contradict what we really believe that are based on our assumptions. So it's important to understand these two levels of organizational culture, the assumption level and the value level. Now, let me give you some examples here of what assumptions and values are. So I work in higher education, all right? So what are some of the assumptions in higher education? Well, that education is a good thing, right? That there's a lot of people out there that need education. That we hold a particular type of education that's, good and maybe even better than others, right? We're a Christian university, so we believe that students need to have a Christian education, right? So these are all assumptions which lead to our values, right? So our values are things like, we educate. We are an institution of higher education with biblical foundations. We teach people the truth. We teach people business. We teach them theology, biblical studies, whatever it is they need to learn. And we do it in sort of the traditional college structure, right? Okay, so these are assumptions that lead to values. And then you have behavior. So what are behaviors in culture? Well, behavior is anything you can see. So the way I talk, the way I dress, the way we organize, the way we lay out our building, right? So you can have different types of culture. You can have formal culture, you can have informal culture, hierarchical, loose, ad hoc sorts of culture, which leads me to a great model that I like to teach, which is Cameron and Quinn. Cameron and Quinn came up with what's called what is it called? Cameron and Quinn came up with it'll come to me in a second here, but they came up with 4 different types of culture based upon whether an organization was internally focused or externally focused, or whether or not they were flexible or they were stable, right? Okay, so that gives you 4 types of different cultures. Oh, competing values, that's what it's called. It's called the Competing Values Framework. I knew it would come to me. Cameron and Quinn, Competing Values Framework. And this idea says that if we are internally focused and stable, we will be what's called a clan culture. Now, a clan culture is kind of like a church. It's a friendly, fun, caring type of place. We value relationships. We value our leaders as mentors and father figures, right? The unity of the group is important. It's not necessarily about accomplishment or achievement. It's about being together sort of in a family. We're a family, and people don't leave the family. You don't speak bad of the family, right? We learned that from The Godfather. You never speak bad of the family. All right. But then there's other kinds of cultures, right? So there's another culture that's the exact opposite. It's not stable and internal, it's flexible and external. That's what's called an adhocracy a market culture. Okay, so market culture is externally focused, and it's a bit more fluid in the way it's structured. So why is it externally focused? Because it's all about numbers, and it's about accomplishing goals, and it's about making the sale, and it's about growing, right? And so this is a whole different type of field. It doesn't really matter if you're comfortable or happy. It's about whether or not you are meeting your target, whether you are meeting your goals or not. If you're not, well, you're probably not going to be part of the organization very long. And then there's a couple of other kinds. There's the bureaucratic, which is internal and stable, right? Internal and stable, yeah. And this says that it's all about structure, it's all about process, it's all about hierarchy, it's all about continuity, it's all about efficiency, right? It's all about scale, all those sorts of things, right? And so the bureaucratic culture is one that's very rigid and rule-bound. And typically organizations become bureaucratic cultures over time. Right? So you start off loose and inflexible, but in time you sort of become this large bureaucratic. And we use the word bureaucracy sort of as a negative term, but really in the OD literature, organizational development literature, management literature, bureaucracy really refers to a strong, stable, process, rule-bound type of organization, right? It's not the DMV. Well, the DMV is a bureaucracy, but bureaucracy in the literature means that type of organization, okay? So that's another type of culture, right? And you may have worked for this organization. It's all about the rules. It's all about the policies and the process and those sorts of things. And then the last one is externally focused and flexible, I believe. And that's the adhocracy. Now, this is kind of your startup. Think about, some of your tech startups or maybe a new organization that's just getting off the ground. There's not a whole lot of rules, right? It's usually built around one particular leader or group of leaders. It's very flexible. It's very fast-moving. There's a lot of change, et cetera, et cetera. So these are kind of fun, but in time, this adhocracy will grow and it'll turn into this bureaucracy. So Apple computers, for example, used to be this adhocracy with Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, in the garage somewhere in Menlo Park, and yada, yada, yada. Here we are 30 years later, and now it's this behemoth with tons of bureaucracy. Now they like to portray this image that they're still kind of this cool, flexible, hip organization, but the reality is they're just as big as Exxon Oil, right? We don't think of Exxon Oil as this fun, flexible, hip organization, right? But it's all about marketing, it's all about spin, those sorts of things. All right, so those are different types of cultures. There's different aspects of culture. There's what are called what are called subcultures. So there's dominant culture and subculture. Okay, so the dominant culture are sort of the values and beliefs and attitudes that everybody holds. But then there's subcultures, and this could be of a particular subunit. So think about, for example, your marketing department. Typically, maybe you got more creatives, you know, in that part of the organization. They're more free thinking, or maybe R&D. Then you've got, you know, finance and, you know, compliance and the legal department. Those people are much more rule bound and bureaucratic. Right? So you can have these different types of culture, and oftentimes what happens, and again, this goes back to the Cameron and Quinn model, competing values. So you might say, well, should we be more flexible and creative and, you know, innovative, or should we be more stable and rule-bound and process-driven? Well, it kind of depends on your perspective on where you are in the organization. So a lot of times, if you're closer to the outside of the organization, the outside here, I'm drawing the outside of the frame, you want to be a little more creative and flexible, because that's where the action is, right? Wherever you interact with the environment, you need to be a little more flexible and creative, because guess what? The environment's changing, right? We don't live in a static world anymore. And so because the environment is changing, you need to be able to adapt, and that's where the thinking needs to be a little more flexible and changing and kind of big picture, where are we going to be in the future? Now, if you're inside of that internal part of the organization, the core, the part that holds together the rules and ensures continuity, right, over the years, then you're going to be a little more rule-bound, a little more rigid, a little more bureaucratic. So the tension that happens in any organization, this is natural, it's not just your organization, but there's always going to be a tension, a built-in tension, right, between those two tensions, the drive for change and innovation and the need for stability and predictability and scale and all those sorts of things. All right, and then there's another idea. So you've got subculture, dominant culture, you've got weak culture and strong culture, right? Strong culture means the values are held strong, deeply held by a lot of people. Weak culture means that they're, you know, not as well held by fewer people. So the goal for leaders and managers and organizations is to kind of develop a strong culture where everybody believes in the types of values widely and deeply across the organization, right? So that's important. One other thing I'm going to say here, and this might be the last thing I'm going to say, is you need to align culture and strategy. So you might have a strategy of growth, and that's good. And if you've all agreed that you want to grow as an organization, that, you know, becoming big is important to you, then you need to develop a culture that's going to support that. Now, what if you're currently like a clan culture? And what do I mean by clan culture? It's this friendly, warm, or one big family together. That kind of culture is not necessarily going to support that kind of a strategy. And this is the tension a lot of churches have, right? Well, how do we remain small and friendly like a family yet grow large? It often doesn't happen, right? I mean, I've been part of mega churches before, and as much as they talk about being a warm, friendly family, the reality is it's run just like, you know, Starbucks Incorporated. You know, you get the same predictable product no matter where you go, but, you know, it's... All right, I'm not going to discount the mega churches, right? They're doing a lot of good things out there. So the point is aligning your culture and your strategy, right? So you might have a mismatch between your culture and your strategy, or you might just say, hey, this is so deeply embedded in our culture, we're never going to be able to accomplish this kind of strategy. So maybe you're not going to be the biggest organization in the world because you're committed to your people and to your values, all those sorts of things. So it's very difficult to change that to scale when you're committed to being a close family environment. Now, some organizations do it, but typically what happens is if this is your strategy, this is going to change, and now all of a sudden your cultures become more market. It's going to be external, it's going to be about numbers. Low performers are not going to stick around very long, right? Now, that would never happen in a clan, right? Low performers stick around forever. Oh, crazy Uncle Joe, we know him, we love him, he's just going to work in the corner office. But, you know, if you're high-performing GE or whatever, you know, they cut the low performers on a regular basis because their goal is growth. Well, there's probably more I could say about culture. I'm probably forgetting some things, but fortunately, you've got it all written down in your textbook. So once again, I encourage you to read, to dive in, to take advantage of all the different resources available for you there in Cengage and elsewhere, and learn all you can about organizational culture. And of course, learn about structure and change as well. I didn't really talk about those here in my video because I thought there was enough to talk about in culture, but you need to learn about structure, and you need to learn about organizational change, right? Those are big picture, important issues for management. So I want you to dig into the textbook on those as well and learn all you can, all right? So you can pass those quizzes, you have interesting discussions, and write your paper as well. So that's about it for now. Blessings to you all. It's been nice to be with you these 5 weeks, and I'll do a wrap-up video for you guys later. Blessings to you all.